So the United States says that we will not be returning to large-scale kinetic operations in Iran anytime soon, as we wait for the economic pressure to, quote, collapse the regime. But here's the thing, that might actually prompt the return to fighting that President Trump is hoping to avoid. See, while Iran is certainly feeling the impact of the blockade and sanctions, hardliners inside of the regime are arguing that the time to strike is now. Force the United States to an actual agreement before the economic situation deteriorates even further. Now, just yesterday, speaking to this, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, talking about the added sanctions and economic means being levied against Iran, said, quote, "It is a 1-2 punch. We have the blockade on Iran, and we are going to have the toughest sanctions in history. It's going to work in Iran, and we're going to collapse this regime." I feel like that's the first time we've talked about or heard the government talk about collapsing the Iranian regime since the early days of the conflict. He added, quote, "If we are doing the maximum economic pressure, then that means that likely there will not be a large-scale kinetic restart." So we've clearly gone the route of economic warfare, trying to choke off Iran and force them to the negotiating table. I do want to stress that this could have been done at the same time as kinetic operations, could have been done ahead of. There's no requirement that this is done in lieu of or separate to kinetic operations, but we've made pretty clear that our preference right now is economic warfare over kinetic strikes, lethal activity. Now, there's also the question of off-ramps right now. Both Iran and the United States in recent weeks and months have put forward pretty maximalist demands, with President Trump calling for unconditional surrender towards the beginning of the conflict. And that always raises the debate. I mean, we like to look at World War II and say unconditional surrender, look, it worked. There's another side to this as well, where I think there's a genuine conversation about when you demand unconditional surrender or complete capitulation from the adversary, does that force them to dig in and fight longer than if there was some sort of middle ground off-ramp? I think that's a real consideration we have to keep in mind right now. And when looking at the sanctions and the blockades, this is not a question of will they work? Will they do damage to the Iranian economy? They are. We've always known that that would be the case. The question is if this will be enough to force an Iranian surrender within an acceptable time period. What I mean by that is if we put this blockade and expand these sanctions to maybe China, like economic warfare against China that is doing business with Iran, so significant in a lot of ways. If we do that, and that manages in, say, a month to get Iran back to the negotiating table to maybe start talking about their nuclear program, that's not a victory. We can't do that. That means that this is not enough to actually get the Iranian regime to capitulate. The other side of this is if this takes 5 years, maybe they do volunteer to give up all of their enriched uranium, never pursue nuclear weapons from here forward, handing over or elimination of their nuclear program and more. All of the goals laid out by the United States at the beginning of the conflict. But if it takes 5 years of economic warfare to get there, that also didn't work. Think of the damage that would be done in that time to the international or the global economy as well as to the region. That very well might outweigh the actual benefits of getting to that agreement. But again, Iran is feeling the pain right now. For the first time, we're hearing government officials inside of Iran talk about just how difficult a situation they're in. President Pezeshkian earlier stressed that the government does not deny the shortages and that it would be better to end the war now while Iran is in a position of strength and dignity. The entire world recognizes its victory. Speaker Kalibaf stated that no matter how much military power Iran possesses, if the people are hungry, it will not be able to endure. And these public acknowledgments of the pain that Iran is feeling is significant. And there's one way to look at this, I think, with rose-colored glasses and say they're on the brink. If we just push a little bit harder, we might actually bring them around. But I think there's another side here as well. New York Times quoted Dennis Ross, a former Middle East negotiator, saying Iran now reads President Trump as not wanting to escalate militarily. And I think that's fair based off everything we've seen. They said that creates an incentive for Iran then to show that might be an option for them. So if they know that we are desperately trying to avoid a continuation of the conflict in terms of military strikes, that might be a card that Iran looks to now that they no doubt are feeling more and more pressure. But before diving into how these new Iranian statements are being interpreted from a number of different analysts, a quick thank you to the sponsor of today's video, Cover On. So a few months ago, my wife got a call from someone who said they were with the police department in a city we used to live in. They told her that she owed a fine because she hadn't shown up for a court date, which was news to us, especially since we hadn't lived in that area for more than 10 years. The problem was, it sounded pretty legit. They had her personal information, past addresses, phone number, and more. But when they said the fine had to be paid on the spot over the phone, it became clear this was some sort of scam. Which is why I partnered with today's sponsor, Coveron, who handle identity theft protection for exactly this type of nonsense. Coveron runs 24/7 dark web monitoring. They watch your credit activity and send real-time alerts the second something looks off. So you find out when someone opens a card in your name, not 11 months later when a collection letter shows up. And if something does go wrong, they don't just say sorry. They assign a dedicated restoration specialist to handle the paperwork and disputes with you. Plus, you get real financial backup. Up to $2 million for identity theft recovery costs, up to $25,000 in home title insurance, up to $50,000 if you're targeted with cyber extortion or threats, and up to $10,000 if you lose money to scams or online fraud. Now, this is for U.S. customers only, and setting it up took me less time than we spent arguing with a fake police guy. The first 100 users get 20% off with code PrestonStewart at coveron.com/PrestonStewart. That's COVERON. Link and code are in the description below. Coveron.com/PrestonStewart. Code Preston Stewart. Take the 10 minutes. Future you will appreciate it. And thank you so much to Coveron for sponsoring today's video. Now, a lot of folks very knowledgeable on the region and on the Iranian government and Iranian history chimed in on these statements from the president and the speaker earlier today. We're going to run through a couple of them, and all of these, of course, will be linked in the description below if you want to read further. Raz Zimt, the director of the Iran program at the Institute for National Security Studies, said, quote, Tehran still appears to assess that despite recent developments, it retains the ability to inflict significantly greater damage on the global economy and its Gulf neighbors, and that the price of a possible escalation, even to the point of renewed hostilities, is lower than the cost of yielding to U.S. demands. Again, kind of the hardliner debate inside of Iran. Hamidreza Azizi, researcher and analyst on Iran and the Middle East, added to this, saying, quote, the problem is that the hardliners have a point. According to them, even if Tehran is prepared to return to diplomacy, there is little indication that Trump wants to return to the previous terms. His new economic campaign suggests that Washington may instead use Iran's growing difficulties to demand more. This is creating a vicious circle. The longer the confrontation continues, the stronger that economic case for diplomacy becomes. But the more Washington increases pressure, the harder it becomes for Iranian leaders to make concessions without appearing to capitulate. Again, that debate around unconditional surrender. And I know that term hasn't been thrown out a lot recently, but it kind of, I think it perfectly frames this conversation. Is it better to push for that, or is it better to find some place in the middle where maybe the Iranian leadership right now could come to a consensus, and I'm making things up here, but agree to certain portions, and we can address other aspects later. Then Danny Centrinowitz, a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council, spoke to this specifically when he said the argument of the hardline elements in Iran is if Washington intends to maintain maximum economic pressure while offering no viable diplomatic exit, Iran has little reason to exercise restraint. From their perspective, escalation may be preferable to accepting an indefinite economic siege, particularly if they believe President Trump will become more risk-averse as the U.S. midterm elections approach. That's probably a safe assessment, I would say. I mean, poll after poll after poll shows that the Iran war is not popular in the United States, and it has become increasingly less popular the longer it has drug on. So hard to imagine that the president or the U.S. government would deliberately escalate this conflict in the next 1, 2, 3 months here. So it is worth looking at the economic plan. What exactly are we planning to do to actually bring Iran to the negotiating table in the hopes that that will be enough? President Trump a few days ago announced his new economic D-Day. Said, quote, today I am announcing the most crushing economic operation ever taken against any country. This will be economic warfare and isolation on an unprecedented scale. Today I am announcing that any country that allows its financial institutions, businesses, airports, or government entities to provide any type of lifeline to Iran will itself face tremendous economic consequences. So look, Iran has been the focus of pretty intense sanctions for a long time, and we've talked about it on this channel. I'm skeptical that sanctions alone or economic warfare alone is going to be enough for a country to give up what they view as, or give into what they view as an existential threat. I think North Korea right now is just a perfect example of this. Pretty well isolated off the world stage and has been for some time. There's no reason to think that a few more sanctions on North Korea is going to force them to give up their nuclear weapons. And Iran likely views that the same way right now, albeit not with nuclear weapons, but with their nuclear program and control or degree of control over the Strait of Hormuz. The million-dollar question here is China. And what do we do with that? So Dr. Neil Quilliam, a energy policy, geopolitics, and foreign affairs specialist at the Chatham House, said China purchases over 80% of Iran's oil. Quote, the bigger question is whether Washington is willing to bear the economic and diplomatic costs of targeting major buyers, especially in China, as well as close allies such as the UAE, which remains a key node in capital flows for Iran, though cut financial ties on Tuesday. That is where rhetoric meets reality. There are so many areas where the oil and or money is moved. Iraq, UAE, Malaysia, overland routes through Pakistan, Turkey, Central Asia. So there is a lot to capture. So this broad statement, in my understanding, is the United States is set to roll out more details on this program next week. But this could be all-encompassing, like genuinely economic warfare against China. And that's one of the big questions here. Are we actually going to go in on that or not? If we do, it no doubt would lead to increased economic hardship for Iran and may well force their hand to capitulate. But are we really going to enter into some degree of economic war with China? Edward Goldman, a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, is skeptical. He was quoted in the New York Times talking about this, said, quote, Iran has been under comprehensive sanctions for years. The only major thing left to do is aggressively target Iran's trading partners, above all, China. He added, I'm skeptical Trump is willing to risk instigating an economic war with China right now. Again, I think there's a lot of, if we go back to the popularity of the war in Iran, the American people, I don't think are willing to make much of a sacrifice day in and day out for the continuation of this war. There has been a direct impact, especially when you go to to fill up the car at the gas station. Going after China, dragging them, involving them directly in that sense into the conflict would just hit the American economy that much more. Hard to see that being a viable option right now. Just not a great time for the U.S. to tackle that. Now, Politico added to this with Ali Vaez, the International Crisis Group's Iran program director, who said, quote, it's undeniable that there is economic pressure. The question is whether there is a breaking point. And I would say for a regime that is fighting for its life and has never hesitated to transfer economic pain to its population, there is no breaking point. Maybe. I actually kind of like the assessment here from Richard Goldberg, the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, that says, listen, we are kind of entering uncharted territories here, so we can be skeptical as we want to. And I am, for what it's worth. The economic sanctions did not bring Russia to the negotiating table. They've found ways around it. Iran is in the same boat where they've been operating through a number of sanctions for years. They know how to do this. It might hurt. It is hurting. Will it be enough for them to capitulate? I think no. But Richard Goldberg had a good quote in U.S. News earlier where he said, quote, I caution everyone, including myself, who has worked on sanctions, who's worked on financial warfare, to have the humility to admit that we are in uncharted waters. So definitely leave some room for that. We're entering into new territory, especially if we're not just going after Iran and not just having the blockade, but if we start layering financial penalties and sanctions on their trading partners, especially China, that truly is uncharted territory. So maybe if we decide to go all in, this could be enough to force the Iranian regime to the negotiating table on the terms that would be acceptable to the United States and our allies around the world. Short of that, just adding a few more sanctions here or there or keeping the blockade in place for some time, I'm skeptical that we're going to see any significant resolution. And I think it's increasingly likely that Iran is not just going to sit there and take this. The longer it goes on, the worse of an economic situation they're put in, they're likely to lash out. And it is very easy to see a scenario where they don't even go after the U.S. military, per se. They go after our Gulf allies in the region, where they get countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Oman, Bahrain, Kuwait, and others to pressure the United States and say, hey, we're on the receiving end, because we've seen this before. We're on the receiving end of these Iranian attacks. We don't have the help to defend against them anymore. Enough of these drones and or missiles are getting through. It's causing a major issue to our country. Please stop. I don't think that's a crazy strategy for Iran to pursue. And the longer this economic warfare goes on and as it ramps up, I expect we're probably going to see some degree of that as Iran tries to break the chokehold that we are putting them in right now. But that's all we got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.